I will start by introducing the ABC network, which contains 3 cells, cell A, cell B, and cell C. An event happens in which neurotransmitter molecules are released from cell A. 4 things may happen when those molecules are released into the synapse. First, the neurotransmitter molecules may dissipate and float away. Second, they can reuptake back into cell A. Third, they may also metabolize. And fourth, they can bind to the ionotropic receptors on the dendrites of cell B. For the purpose of this demonstration, we will focus on what happens when neurotransmitter molecules bind to cell B within the dendritic arborization. Here we have a much larger version of the presynaptic membrane on cell A and the postsynaptic membrane on cell B. As you can see, neurotransmitter molecules are released into the synapse from cell A, and they may bind to the ionotropic receptors on the postsynaptic membrane of cell B. Here we have a semi-permeable lipid bilayer, which is the makeup of the presynaptic and the postsynaptic membranes. So, we have a neurotransmitter molecule and our ionotropic receptors. When the neurotransmitter molecule binds, the pore opens and sodium is able to move into the cell. Sodium moves into the cell by way of osmosis and electrostatic pressure. In other words, sodium moves down the concentration gradient. So it goes to where there is a lesser concentration of sodium, and also because of the difference in charges between the inside and the outside of the cell, the opposite charges attract, which also compels sodium to move into the cell. As previously mentioned, there is a difference between the charges in the inside and the outside of the cell. The inside of the cell is more negative, while the outside of the cell is more positive. On the inside, we have a greater concentration of potassium. On the outside of the cell, we have a greater concentration of sodium. If we were to take an oscilloscope to measure the charges within the cell, we would get a graph that looks like this. At rest, the inside of the cell would measure to negative 70 millivolts, which is point A on this graph. When the binding of a neurotransmitter molecule takes place, we can have an excitatory postsynaptic potential created. At point B, this would also be called depolarization. But because this depolarization and EPSP does not meet the threshold of excitation, an action potential cannot be created at point B. However, at point C, several EPSPs are created and the threshold of excitation is met at negative 65 millivolts. From here, points C through E, we have a massive depolarization as sodium enters the cell. However, as sodium enters the cell, potassium leaves the cell. So from point E through G, we also have a hyperpolarization. From that point, the sodium-potassium pump begins to bring the cell back to resting membrane potential as potassium leaves the cell. Once the action potential moves out of the axon hillock, it does not stop. Propagation of the action potential must begin in order for it to move down the axon shaft and eventually transmit information to cell C. The whole process of the propagation of the action potential is called saltatory conduction. As action potential moves in a wave-like fashion from one node of RON-VA to another node of RON-VA, it must open voltage-gated channels, which allows sodium to come in and potassium to go out. So if we were to measure the movement of the action potential from one node to the other, on time 1, we would find that the action potential would be in the axon hillock. At time 2, we would find that the action potential will have left the axon hillock, so the axon hillock returns to rest, and node 1 would show the action potential. At time 3, we would find that node 1 has returned to rest and the action potential has moved on to node 2, and so on and so forth, all the way down to the terminal buttons. From that point, the whole neuron story then repeats itself. We have now reached the end of our neuron story.